Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session on the Environmental Role of Law Index. I am Seth Davis. I am the chair of the section of Environment, Energy, and Resources of the American Bar Association. If any of you are not familiar with the way the American Bar Association works, we have a good number of substantive sections where people of like interest get together to share ideas and improve themselves in various topics of law, and ours is concerned with environmental law, energy, and natural resource and protection thereof. With me are two of our past chairs. My immediate right is Claudia Rast from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I should have said I'm from around New York, the exurbs of New York City. Claudia is from a law firm in Ann Arbor, past section chair. On my far right is Lee DeHihns from Atlanta, Georgia. And the other lawyer with us today is not a section officer, but he's a member, Steve Wolfson from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And these two ladies are taking great pains to disassociate themselves from us. Not being lawyers, one can understand that. But they are Sarah Long and Christine Pratt from the World Justice Project, who have been really doing the nuts and bolts work on this index. Just to give you a brief history of what has gone on in this project, from the first of the World Justice Forums, the idea of using some method of measuring the quality of a country's rule of law, adherence and compliance in the environmental area was discussed. It began with a paper given by the then ABA president, Karen Mathis, on rule of law and environmental issues. My two colleagues have been at most, if not all, of the prior World Justice Forum meetings working on this concept. And during the past few years, we have worked with the World Justice Project on putting together a specific survey intended to measure countries' achievement in the rule of law area in the environmental field. And today we are releasing the first initial findings of that survey, sharing with you how that survey and this index is shaping up. And remember, throughout, it's very much a work in progress. We think we've accomplished quite a lot. We know there's a lot more that has to be done. So we welcome your comments and your suggestions. So what we'll do is we'll turn it over to Sarah and Christine for a presentation that they have planned. After that, we'll talk about some of the particular concepts, and we hope we'll have some time left over for questions from the floor. So.
Thank you. First, I just want to thank the section of Environment, Energy, and Resources Task Force. This has been, today's the culmination of almost 5 years of collaboration on this specific project, and we really appreciate all of you being here to present, and we also are very grateful to the task force members who were not able to be here in person today. So I'm going to start just to provide a very brief overview on all the things that have been that we've been working on throughout the past few years that brought us to the point that we are at today, where we're ready to share our pilot methodology. So as I mentioned, we've been collaborating for several years, and we decided that we wanted to, having both shared a commitment to the rule of law, we wanted to come up with a tool that could be useful and actionable for people to measure and assess where were the areas of environmental compliance that were being well implemented and enforced, and where were there any possible gaps between what are the environmental laws on the books and versus the outcomes in practice. So this is a very broad field, the environment, so one of the first things that we had to do was to narrow down what we're going to focus on and how we will define and conceptualize what we mean when we say assessing the environmental compliance. So we had to narrow it down to a brief menu, a basic menu that are what we think are the most, with the input of the task force, advising what are the most important and the key issues in environmental law that are applicable to the most, that would enable the most coverage possible in conducting the survey in countries around the world. So first what we did is we had multiple years of consultations and meetings and calls where Sarah and I greatly benefited from all the time that the task force took to give their input about these are the issues that are the most important in environmental law, these are what we think can be the most effective to look at in this study. So first what we did is we decided to start with 4 overarching concepts and procedures, which you'll see in Pillar 1. These are the 4 areas that we decided to focus on: access to information, public participation, and administrative procedures and enforcements, as well as judicial procedures and enforcements. So then we had to look at what were the environmental issues that we could really try to cover and to assess. We wanted this to be broad enough that it could be compared across countries, but we also did want to keep it specific enough that it could be useful and actionable. So again, this is not by all means, this is covering a basic menu of these are some of the key environmental issues that we chose to look at in this study. So this is how we got to this conceptual framework here today. And as I mentioned, the ABA task force has been incredibly generous with their time and their expertise. A lot of how we got to create these the preliminary questionnaire is Sarah and I both started with looking at the rule of law, the WJP's Rule of Law Index, which measures adherence to the rule of law in practice. We decided to draw from areas of our expert respondent questionnaire and try to kind of tweak that format for the questionnaire that we wanted to prepare to administer to environmental law experts. So the task force, we had a series of calls and meetings where we would prepare draft questions that we were trying to ask in order to measure and assess the topics that I mentioned in the conceptual framework just a moment ago. And we finalized the questionnaire, and this past spring, we administered the questionnaire in 5 countries for the pilot, which those countries were Argentina, Colombia, Germany, Japan, and Kenya. The ABA task force, with their network of people all over the world, also was very, very helpful in terms of directing us to who are the experts in environmental law in those countries that would be well suited to be able to know what the environmental laws are in the books in that country, and also be able to speak to what, if any, are the gaps between the environmental laws as written and how they are enforced or implemented in practice or experienced in practice. So, as I mentioned, we conducted the pilot this past spring, and my colleague Sarah will be, in a few minutes, she will be speaking in a bit more detail regarding what the initial findings were. I mentioned earlier that environmental law is an extremely broad field, and so here what we wanted to do is we want to ensure that we are filling a niche that can be useful. So we didn't want to completely reinvent the wheel, so we spent a lot of time looking at what are already organizations or indices that are looking at environmental law. None of them were comprehensive. Well, we found that a lot of the tools already there were topical in need, more topical. So this basically is an overview of the overlap between how the first column we compared to our Rule of Law Index. And these are the various guidelines that we found that covered with what we chose to ask in the expert surveys. And my colleague Sarah will be getting into more detail with that. But basically, as I mentioned, we closed the data collection this past spring, and one of the exciting things is that we've been able to start looking at the data and see, are these questions that we've asked, do they make sense? In those 5 countries, if we ask that question, are we able to compare it with the rest of the sample? Sarah will be speaking about what we found, but this is a first try, and we really hope that today we could hear from you what you think and regarding what potentially we may have missed or what might not make sense in the context of country comparison. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Christine. So I'm about to show some of the pilot results from the pilot survey that was administered in 5 countries. So what we have here are the scores corresponding with the framework that my colleague Christine presented. So we score performance on a scale of 0 to 1, with 1 being perfect adherence to environmental rule of law. So in terms of calculating the scores, we aggregate factors 1 through 4, so that's access to environmental information, public participation in environmental decision-making, administrative enforcement and procedures, and judicial enforcement and procedures. So we aggregate those 4 factors to calculate a score for Pillar 1. And again, Pillar 1 is designed to measure the overall enabling environment that allows for environmental rule of law. And then to calculate the score for Pillar 2, we aggregated factors 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, which, as Christine explained, are a modest menu of key environmental issue areas covering air quality and climate, extraction and mining, waste management, water, and biodiversity and forestry. So again, we aggregated those 5 factors to get a score for Pillar 2. If you really want to dig into more depth, you have in front of you a packet that shows all of the 247 questions that were in the expert survey. And you can see in that packet what value we assigned to each possible response option, how we scored it, and how we aggregated all 247 questions to get each factor score. So if you're really curious to know exactly what we were asking, how we arrived at those scores, definitely dig into that packet. And so this is just to give a visual representation of the pillar scores that were on the previous slide. So the gray columns represent the scores for Pillar 1, which is overarching laws and procedures, and the purple bars represent the scores for Pillar 2, which is overall compliance by various issue areas. And you can see for some countries, those 2 pillars are more aligned, and for some, there's a little bit of a gap. And this is really just, this spider graph is designed to provide an overall view of a country's performance by the various facets of environmental rule of law that we were measuring. So before showing the scores for all 5 countries, we wanted to show one kind of blown up spider graph so you can get a good look at how it's laid out. So what we have here is a spider graph. Each of the 9 factors are represented by the 9 points on the edge of the spider graph. The very inside of the circle represents the worst possible score, which would be a score of 0, and the outer edge of the spider graph represents the best possible score of 1. So this is kind of a blown up view of Argentina's performance. But here you can see the performance of all 5 countries, which is also on the handout in front of you if you want to be able to read it a little bit better. But again, this allows you to see how well-rounded a country's performance is. The overall size of the purple spider graphs gives you an idea of how strong the country's performance is. And then we are considering 3 different weighting methods for calculating the overall rule of law index score. So the first method is giving equal weight to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So just conceptually, if we were to agree that the overall enabling environment is as important as compliance in specific environmental issue areas and gave them even weight, that would give us the scores represented in the gray column. The purple column represents the scores for if we were to give Pillar 1, which is the overarching laws and procedures, slightly heavier weight of 60%. And that's because if you have been looking through the packet, you might notice that there are a lot more, well, not a lot more, there are approximately 60% of the questions feed into the first pillar. So really this was to see, well, if we gave more weight to pillar 1 because more of the questions we're asking inform that pillar, what that score would look like. And lastly, if we were to give all 9 factors, both that feed into the overall enabling environment and compliance by environmental issue area, if we were to give those 9 factors even weight, what the score would be. So that's the green bar. So you can see for most countries there's very little difference, if any difference at all, but this was just for us to see what the outcomes were using these 3 weighting methods. So as Seth and my colleague Christine have mentioned today, this is a pilot, and we need to do a series of consultations, and we need to vet our findings, and we consider this presentation today an opportunity to do that with this group here. But we also did our own first round of internal checks to look at whether or not some of our findings passed the quote-unquote sniff test. So the first was to compare our overall rule of law index scores against the WJP rule of law index scores. And this was important for us because one of the premises that informs our work is that the rule of law is important for every sector of society, including the environment. So it was important for us to see if there was a relationship between the pilot environmental rule of law index scores and the overall WJP rule of law index scores for the 5 pilot countries. Secondly, there are some specific concepts in our rule of law index that line up very well with the concepts in the pilot environmental rule of law index. So what we have here are the factor scores on the bottom for factor 1, which looks at access to environmental information. And what we have on the left-hand side is the average of 2 indicators from our rule of law index, which look at publicized information and right to information. So you can see here that there is, a relationship between the pilot scores and these 2 indicators in our rule of law index. We also wanted to check our findings against some other, external indices and measurement tools, which Christine presented earlier. So you may have noticed in the heat table that Christine showed that what we're measuring in our index covers almost 90% of the indicators measured by the Environmental Democracy Index. They entirely line up with the Environmental Democracy Index indicators line up with what we're measuring under Pillar 1. So what we have here are the scores for the pilot countries for Pillar 1, and then how they line up with the Environmental Democracy Index scores. One caveat is that the Environmental Democracy Index does not currently measure Germany. They also score countries on a scale of 0 to 3, but we converted that to our scale so that we were more easily comparing, apples to apples. Secondly, this one is a little bit of a bear to interpret, but we also wanted to try to do some cross-checks on some of the findings that fall under the second pillar, so the more specific environmental issue areas. So the Yale Environmental Performance Index is an index that collects administrative data on environmental outcomes in 9 environmental issue areas. And they score countries on a scale of 0 to 100, which again, we converted to a scale of 0 to 1. So what we have here is this green bar is our score for the factor on biodiversity in water, which for Japan, they received a score of 0.65. The Environmental Performance Index uses 2 different indicators, so they have a score for forestry and a score for biodiversity and habitat. So you can see that our pilot score kind of falls in the middle of theirs. Again, this purple bar is our score for water, so Japan receives a score of 0.85. Again, EPI has a score for water resources and a score for water and sanitation. So you can see, again, we're kind of falling right in the middle there. And then this last factor is our factor on air quality and climate, where Japan received a score of 0.64. And the Environmental Performance Index gives Japan a score of 0.44 for climate and energy and a score of 0.85 for air quality. And so this is kind of an overall view of what that check looks like. So we did this for all 5 countries just to see really where our score is falling relative to their scores. I mean, it's a different methodology. They rely on administrative data. It looks entirely at environmental issue areas, but we thought this was still an important check. Lastly, for those of you who are familiar with our flagship Rule of Law Index, you may know that we use 2 sources of data. So we administer a household survey of 1,000 respondents in the 3 largest cities, and we also administer 4 different expert surveys for our flagship Rule of Law Index. And we thought the household survey would be an interesting opportunity to survey the general public about a few environmental issue areas that they may know about. We had a few limitations. One of them is that the general public may not be very knowledgeable about environmental issues, and our surveys are also administered in cities, so they had to kind of be limited to issues that would affect urban respondents. But we did include a handful of questions, and so what we wanted to do was see how the general public's perceptions and experience with a few key areas such as access to environmental information, vehicle emissions, or bribery in a few areas compares with the experiences and perceptions of experts. So what we have here is the question we included in our 2016 general population poll for Colombia. So how easy is it to find information on the level of air pollution in your city? And so this score represents the aggregated responses of 1,000 respondents in Colombia. And here you can see 3 related questions that were asked to experts in Colombia. Again, they're not exactly the same question, but they touch on a similar theme. So we thought it would be interesting just to see how the general public's perceptions and experience compared to that of experts. And we had about 7 questions included in our general population poll that had comparable themes to about 9 of the expert questions that we asked. So then looking ahead to next steps, we feel very excited about the framework and methodology that we've piloted, but of course this will entail some type of refinement before we scale this up for a larger number of countries. One of the things we would like to do is do a more in-depth question level analysis and see, are there questions that maybe an environmental generalist can't easily answer? And you might have noticed on one of Christine's earlier slides that we're asking nearly 250 questions. So also taking a look at that might help us shorten the questionnaire, maybe encourage some higher response rates. We also, need to do a series of vetting and consultations. We were grateful to the ABA task force to help us develop the questionnaires. They arranged consultations with the World Resources Institute, the Environmental Law Institute, and the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. But when we first piloted the flagship Rule of Law Index, in 6 countries, our chief research officer and executive director undertook a process of holding a series of consultations with our friends at Hill, the World Bank, the IMF, Harvard, Yale, to really have our survey instrument and methodology vetted extensively before publishing our first public report for 35 countries. So this is something that's very valuable for us. That's why we're excited to be presenting today, and this is why we've very transparently laid out how we are constructing these scores, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback. And one of the next steps would be scaling up efforts. We're very excited about the idea of following a similar path that our Rule of Law Index followed. It's contingent on a few factors. Of course, the first is resources. This has been entirely a volunteer effort to date, which is why we are so grateful to the ABA SEER for being here today and participating in this effort. But scaling up this study would require a larger research team. It would also require us to identify a large number of potential respondents in a large number of countries. For the pilot, we set a minimum threshold of 5 respondents per country, and some we had more, and that was really the minimum just to test whether the questions worked. But for a full scaled up index, we would ideally want between 20 and 25 expert respondents. And this is difficult because the environment is a niche field, and for our global study, we have a response rate of about 10 to 15% for our expert surveys. So you can imagine how many environmental experts around the world we would need to identify to continue with this methodology. And scaling up would also require building a larger network of partners, in part to identify potential respondents, in part to give us feedback on if and how our approach applies to countries around the world. And that's another reason why we're excited to be presenting this today to an international group from a variety of disciplines, and we think this is really a great place to be beginning that step. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to a panel discussion, but we look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback during the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much. So, I would first like to ask Claudia to give us some historical overview and, as she says, how it started and the substance.
History, yeah. So I went to the first World Justice Forum in Vienna in 2008, and of course it was incredibly impressive. The folks there, it was an exciting time, rolling out the first index, the preliminary index, and ultimately went to the second World Justice Forum in Vienna in November of 2009. And at the time, our section had been involved, and DeHihns can actually speak to that too, and Howard Kennison in the original funding by various sections across the ABA of that initial rule of law project. And our section was involved in that initial funding. And it occurred to me as I was sitting there in the audience listening to Juan and Alejandro, how in the application and the environment being such a critical thing for all of us, good air, good water, good soil, good food to drink, eat and drink, of what an index that really crossed that substantive area of environment, and what we as a section of environment, energy, and resources lawyers could do to try to get that going. And so in a conversation with Juan and Alejandro and others of the World Justice Project, we said, what can we do to add a substantive component of this rule of law index? And of course, the simple answer was sponsor us, fund us, be our volunteers, help us, and advise us. And so while Christine points out it was in the last 5 years, we really started this in 2009, jumping up and down and saying, how can we help and how can we get that going? And it's been this is a very exciting moment to see the results of that work. Everybody, the volunteers, the World Justice Project people, in launching this. And so your input and your comments are critical to making this thing live and grow.
Well, thank you. Next, I'll turn it over to DeHihns, who, besides his work in this, has done a lot of working on the question of sustainability, sustainable development, and working with the United Nations and other international groups.
Thanks, Seth. I'm very happy to be here today, and like Claudia, I was at the first World Justice Forum in 2008. In the field of sustainable development, the ABA has been involved since 2003 with looking at sustainable development issues. It came after the UN Forum in Johannesburg in 2002. And from that, then our section began working on these issues, leading up to us sending a delegation to Rio Plus 20 in Rio de Janeiro in June of 2012. And out of that, Jim Silkenit, then president of the ABA in the audience today, gave me the honor of chairing the ABA Task Force on Sustainable Development, and William Hubbard, who you've seen throughout the program, succeeded Jim as president and appointed me to serve a second year in that effort. And from that effort, then we had a final task force report which called for the ABA to continue to be very much involved in sustainable development topics. That then led sequentially to getting very much involved in the United Nations work on sustainable development goals, which, as you know, they adopted in September of 2015. And William Hubbard sent a letter to the Secretary General of the UN at the time, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, offering the ABA's assistance as those goals came forward to fruition. And then as recently as May of this year, Linda Klein, the current president of the ABA, who also has been here speaking, gave a speech talking about the ABA's role in sustainability. So we have a long track record of playing a role in this and educating lawyers and talking to lawyers around the world about the importance of a lawyer's role in looking at sustainable development topics. In the UN goals, there's 17 goals. 11 of them have a role specifically related to the world of environmental law. And all of them within them have a role for lawyers to play, for everyone to play for that matter. Goal 2, sustainable agriculture. You can't have sustainable agriculture without proper use of the land, without proper use of chemicals, the whole organic, natural growing of products, how they're treated, how they're then packaged and sold. You have goal 3, just on protecting health. One of the sub-goals there is making sure that we do away with pollution, which leads to health problems. Goal 6 is all about water and sanitation. You saw one of the key question areas we talked about in the survey was on water and sanitation. Goal 7 talks about sustainable energy. And sustainable energy then is related then to goal 13, which is climate change. And as you know, as climate change issues have risen to the fore internationally, alternative energy is a good way to deal with keeping fossil fuels out of the environment. Goal 8 and Goal 12 both talk about sustainable production, sustainable consumption, about good supply chains. And again, all of those are within the broad band of sustainability, which is protecting the future of the world for those citizens who will be the citizens of the world at that time. My grandchildren, 12, 17, and 20, are that generation. So I'm protecting them by the work I'm doing today as their grandfather. Goal 11, very interesting goal. It calls for safe, resilient, and sustainable cities. And one of the things you do in such a city is you reduce pollution created by the existence of the city. And you build the city in a way that you build in green space to help treat the water pollution that comes when it rains. Goal 13, I'm not going to talk much about climate change. There's been so much written in the press here in the last 6 months that I could not do it justice in a few moments. Goal 14, the UN just had a global conference on oceans and marine resources, which led to some findings indicating that Goal 14 is indeed a good goal, a goal that needs to be forwarded and taken care of. And finally, Goal 16, rule of law implementation. You've heard a number of speakers throughout this program talk about rule of law implementation. Rule of law as it applies within the context of sustainable development is very important, and it indicates, as you come back to the work on these environmental indicators, that one of the things the UN said has to be done is we cannot just adopt these sustainable development goals and let them lay on the shelf. And so what's happening here with looking at each country's performance coincides with the sustainable development goals do, which because each goal has to then be adopted and embraced in each country of the world. All 193 countries who have adopted the goals unanimously have to go back to their home domestic land and adopt the goals and implement the goals there. It's not up for the UN to do it, it's each country to do it. And so these indicators are one beginning test of how well they've been doing within the environmental piece of that. Then part of what the UN is going to do, and Antonio Guterres, the new Secretary General this year, just on June 30th, a few weeks ago, laid out a major speech on how he, as the Secretary General, wants to transform the UN governance system, both of the member states and the UN institutions, to provide ways to make sure the goals get met by 2030, which, as you know, is now only 13 years away when it was 15 years away when the goals were adopted. And one of the things they're going to be doing is going to dovetail nicely with this work by the World Justice Project is there's going to be data gathered, there's going to be indicators of how well people are progressing, which will feed back into this same process. So all of this information is very, very informative, very helpful. And to go back to a theme that occurred on day one about are you optimistic or pessimistic, I'm very optimistic. I've been practicing environmental law for 43 years. And what has happened in the last 5 years makes me very optimistic that this is on everybody's agenda all across the world. You've heard it here throughout this program, both in terms of world justice and rule of law, and sustainability is all woven into it, as you've heard throughout all the speakers. So appreciate being here today, appreciate the opportunity to talk about what the ABA has been doing and we'll keep on doing.
Thank you, Lee. And Steve Wolfson's with the US EPA, and he is actually here in official capacity. What you may have heard about what's going on at the EPA notwithstanding, they're doing some very positive things in this regard, and Steve's going to tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Seth. And thank you to the WJP folks for having us here and for all the hard work on the index. And for also so openly engaging with the World Resources Institute and the other groups that have been working on indicators in this area to try to find the best way forward. I just want to sort of give one more story about how the awareness of the health impacts of pollution is growing and how that then affects governance. And it starts, this is the story, what we call air monitor diplomacy. It starts when EPA partnered with the US State Department to install air quality monitors on the roof of the embassy, the US Embassy in Beijing, and then began to tweet the results of how dirty or how clean is the air on that particular day, and what are the health concerns. Is it unhealthy, very unhealthy, not so bad? And the idea there was to get that information out to American citizens who are in China, either as visitors or doing business there or studying there, so that they and their families could make informed decisions. Is today a good day to go outside for a run, or is it too polluted so that while I'm trying to get exercise, I'm actually making myself sicker? But the Chinese public quickly learned how to access this information, and it was put into smartphone apps, not by the US, but by third party, put into smartphone apps. And then this sparked an incredible widespread discussion and debate on social media in China. And the term PM 2.5, which is the term for the fine particulates that are inhaled most deeply and that cause the most sort of immediate health impacts. PM 2.5 became a new word in Chinese, and now a surprisingly high percentage of people in Beijing and even across China talk about PM 2.5, and people with the app pull out the Beijing Air Quality Index, and you can actually get the reading for today. It's 120, which is in the orange range, which is not good, but it's not the red. It's not the really scary level. But anyway, so there's been all this debate, and then that then causes pressure for action, because as people become more aware of the pollution and how it affects their health, then they demand change, and they demand more information, and they demand that the pollution be addressed. And what you see now in China, this is not the only factor, but it's one important factor. What you see now in China is the most extensive air quality monitoring system in the world, which didn't exist there 5 years ago. And you see ambitious steps to control air pollution. You see new laws, you see new accountability mechanisms, you see new pollution disclosure requirements at the facility level in China. And there's still a long way to go, but the air pollution levels over the last couple of years are actually starting to come down. So you see how the power of information, getting the information out there to the public, using new technologies to disseminate it widely, then triggers debate and pressure for better environmental governance, for stronger implementation of environmental law.
Thank you. Just to throw a few general questions to the panel. Do we need a model environmental code? We talk about measuring rule of law index. What about countries that don't have laws? Should we be sending out a model code? Is there one already? How should this be developing?
Let me start with that, since I suggested we talk about it. You saw in the index work that so as to not start with a raw data baseline, but to look at what other indicators are out there, gives you an idea that there are some model ways to go about protecting the environment of a particular geopolitical jurisdiction. I think it would be helpful to have work done on an international model code. To some extent, we have that in things like the Marpol Treaty. We have treaties on international disposal of hazardous waste and those kind of things. But those are more treaties that basically say do or don't do things, as opposed to what's the standard set of criteria. I think a lot of work's been done in this arena, but I think a lot more could be done. I think everybody would benefit from having access to that kind of information. And then they'd have to then tailor it to their own domestic needs, their own cultural needs, depending on how big your country is, depending on what your economic status is. You wouldn't necessarily be able to embrace the entire robust array of environmental laws, say we have in the United States or in the EU, but you could look at those and say, okay, these seem to be protecting their country pretty well. And you could look at the index and say, okay, are the laws in that country good enough to protect the country? And the separate question then is, are you implementing the laws to really protect their citizens? So I think a lot more work could be done in the model arena.
And it's interesting, Lee, you make the point of model laws, and we've talked about other standards and so forth. And I recall 25 years ago working with a Polish lawyer that had visited our firm and spent some time and understanding the real environmental blight, frankly, of mining and coal and so forth in Poland. And I said, well, where are your laws? And he said, well, they're here, they're extensive. We've had extensive environmental laws, but we can't enforce them because, cities and towns will just disappear. The livelihood will go away. And so it's interesting, though, to put that juxtaposition with your comment, Steve, about empower the people, inform them of what those impacts are. And so it's a combination both of what the laws on the books may be and the standards that are out there, but really taking that information and educating the people so they can understand the importance of how they can become part of the process.
My take on model laws is yes, it's a very useful thing. The Cambodian Environment Ministry came to us at EPA last year and asked for our help to develop a new environmental code for Cambodia. And so I started looking around to see what model laws are out there, and I was surprised, at least in the pollution control side of the environment field, how few there were. And so it can be useful, and I think the point about adapting to the local legal system is important as well. A model law, the point of a model law is not to force everybody into one mold, but the point of a model law is to begin the process of thinking, how do we go from what we know, which is our own laws, to something that has more general applicability. That's what the model law is. It's getting rid of all the stuff that's particular to one system and trying to come up with something that can be useful anywhere, but then, of course, will require that additional step of adaptation or domestication.
In other words, you've gotten beyond the thought of taking our Clean Water Act and sending it to Cambodia.
Right. It's always the starting point for an American lawyer who's asked about this, and you've got to sort of winnow it down and figure out what are the core elements, just like the WJP folks needed to figure out what are the core elements to measure for this index to be useful. One great example, though, of a new model law effort is the UN Environment Program just published last month on their website a new model law on elimination of lead paint, which is one of the scariest health risks for kids around the world, accounting for lower IQs up to 2 to 4% of GDP in the countries that, the more than 100 countries that have not yet phased out lead paint. The UN Environment Program, World Health Organization, the paint industry, the Council of Paint Associations, NGOs, EPA, other governments have been working together on this for very intensively for the last year or two. And now there's a new model law on phasing out lead paint. It's on the UN and WHO websites. And also I have a few copies if anybody here wants it right away.
Seth, let me add something else. Going back to the Sustainable Development Goals, and you look at all the different environmental protection requirements there are in there if you're going to meet the goal. Every country who's a member state of the UN signed that document. So if their environmental laws don't enable them yet to do what the goal is they signed on to, then they're going to have to do something to bring stuff up. And having a model set of laws and a model set of indicators would be a way to help them measure their progress from wherever they are now to wherever they need to be.
But you say model set of indicators. That's scientific, that's
Right.
measurable, and ultimately that's what we have. It's a very objective type of area we're regulating. What about the concept of information availability? To me, it's one of the important parts of environmental protection. That we, throughout my country, have extensive laws requiring dissemination of information. The more that these have advanced, the more public awareness has advanced. Besides what you've done in China, what else are you involved in? What do you see happening in other countries?
Well, we've seen in the U.S. that just the fact of a polluting facility having to disclose what its emissions are, air pollution, water pollution, releases of waste, transfers of waste, that just having to disclose that, even if it's legal, has given companies the incentive to bring those pollution numbers down. Nobody wants their number to be higher than the next company over. They don't want to be seen as the polluter of the community. And that information also gives the community information they can then use to pressure for improvements. And now 50 countries around the world have adopted similar systems, but there's still a lot of countries that are working towards developing those systems. And we're sitting down with officials in Cambodia and Vietnam in the next few months to try to help them connect with the UN to develop those systems.
To your point, Seth, and this came out in the environmental justice workshop yesterday, and I don't know whether Monica's in the group here, but a woman from NGO from Indonesia was talking about how they have developed a baseline app of indicators on a mobile app. And the point is to educate village women who seem to be the resource for information and education about those indicators, that baseline statement, because Indonesia can be, there's a lot of mining. 60% of the area doesn't have electricity. And she says, describes how do they have phones if they have no electricity? Well, they all gather them together and put them on batteries, and they keep throwing the batteries away, buy new batteries, and loading up their phones. But just getting that information to the villagers on their environmental baseline is really vital.
I mean, the model legislation for this in the United States probably is, the acronym is EPCRA, Environmental Protection Community Right to Know Act. It was part of Superfund passed now in 1980. And what that requires each company in the United States to publish their releases of pollution into the air, the water, the land, and what those levels of chemicals are, how many pounds, tons, whatever it may be. Then EPA in each state compile the data. Then you sort of get an annual report that says, okay, the pollution in Connecticut is this, the pollution in Georgia is that, and so Georgia's worse than Connecticut or vice versa. And then within each industrial category, you can say, this company over here is the highest air emitter of, methyl ethyl death, and that then sort of shames them into saying, look, I want to be there, A, because I don't want to be first on that list, B, I want my stockholders to know I'm not that bad a company, and C, I don't want the tort lawyers who know they can sue me for having all these toxic effects in my community to come sue me and make me pay millions of dollars for damage to the environment and human health.
Yeah, I can tell you, I had the privilege once of being in a plant the day that came out, and that plant was named as the #1 toxic emitter in its state, a very small state at that, and it had a considerable impact, I can tell you. Yeah. But even beyond that, part of that law that was passed, which seems elemental to us now, but was a big step when it came about, was coming out of the Bhopal incident in India, of letting emergency responders know what types of dangerous substances could be in the facility, how they should be treated, and scraping away the old trade secret protection idea that things are proprietary and emergency responders, let alone the people at large, don't necessarily have the right to know that. And I think that concept, at least in the States, is in the trash can now.
So there's an NGO in China with the slogan, every smokestack should be transparent. And they've created a pollution map app so that you can pull up on your smartphone, where's the pollution coming from in my neighborhood? I think that's the next step. And of course, our toxics release inventory is a yearly thing, but the future, it's going to be, I think in many countries, it's going to be real-time information right down to the local level.
I think what's been missing over all the years of my practice is the more the information becomes available, what's still missing is telling the public what the information means.
Exactly.
You can put this toxic release inventory out. It's a very technical report that's many pages thick. You can read through it, but unless you've got a scientist telling you, this is bad for you, bad for your children, bad for your grandmother who has breathing problems, here's what you need to do about it. That's the part I think is still missing today. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the part that takes what Bill Newcomb called openness versus transparency and opening it up, and then really meets the goals of rule of law, which is we're giving you access to information and we're telling you how to protect yourself once you have the information.
Yeah. The scientific component of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and ultimately that's where this new index is so valuable as it gets spread out and the number of countries are increased.
Yeah. And just giving out information without context and explanation may not be enough. How much should we, or how much do we in the index measure cultural differences or national differences that
probably goes over there.
Goes through this? Can you comment to that at all?
Yeah, so I would say that the answer to that is that we are attempting just to look at, the outcomes in terms of compliance, not necessarily looking at the laws that, we might run into issues with different legal frameworks, and really just looking at, a few key issue areas, kind of just some of the most basic, emissions inventory, things of that nature. And, do people, if they have an environmental grievance, do they know how to, resolve that dispute? Is there an administrative body? Is there a judicial body that they can go to? Are, local chiefs and elders part of, the environmental decision-making process, things of that nature? And as Christine mentioned, part of our approach was to adapt the questionnaires from our QRQR qualified respondents questionnaire methodology, which already does try to incorporate, what justice, what administrative bodies look like in different countries.
Okay. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I think we can throw it open to questions. And I'm not going to give the canned speech about don't make speeches, give us a question. If you want to make a speech and tell us something about reaction to this, we'd like to hear it. So,
not a long one.
A brief, well-considered, well-constructed speech. But I think the first hand I saw was in the back there.
Hello, Holly McHugh. I'm with Caring. Anyway, if anybody needs to know who that is, you can come ask me later. I have a question about whether or not the index is covering interpretation of the law. I specifically live in Hong Kong, in China. A lot of the factories that I see, and lived in China for a very long time, they often interpret the law in a way that is either exaggerated or, anyway, just inaccurate usually. One province in southern China is interpreting a request for low VOC paints to mean water-based, which means lots of factories have to move. So just wondering if there's anything in this that covers interpretation.
I'm going to completely buck it over there.
I think that there's always going to be limitations. To be comparable across countries, which is what we sought to do, we have to it's about striking a balance between keeping the questions general enough that you can compare them. For instance, we need to keep them general if we can compare Kenya with Colombia, for instance, the two countries covered in the pilot sample. However, I think that it's always good to get more information if possible. I think that, as Sarah mentioned, we kind of are trying to get feedback and refine this methodology, and we'd love to kind of see where it goes from there. And these are ideas that, I think that if especially the task force being more knowledgeable in the environmental area than we are. I think if this could be a worthwhile question to seek out to measure and find answers to, I think that's an interesting thing to explore.
What I would say is, go through this document in some detail, and these questions are dense and intense in many ways. And I think a lot of interpretation is built into this, and that anybody who answers some of the more pointed questions here would have to really address the question that you have. The questions try to focus on what the end result is. So interpretation and nuance is part of that on its way, but it's quite a good question.
And one thing I would add that, this kind of makes me think about some of the question level analysis that we can do moving forward is you might notice that there are a series of questions that say, the laws provide for X regulation. In practice, this regulation is applied. And so I'm glad that you raised this question, because this will also kind of allow us to analyze, is there a gap? Because we are asking these questions about whether that law is on the books and whether it's implemented. And, the WJP's measurement approach, we really do care more about implementation. But, this is an interesting question level analysis that we can do to kind of assess that gap.
Yes. I think Penny was next. Give her the mic.
Yeah, Penny Bright, New Zealand. 2 questions. The first one is regarding access to information. Are you checking whether these countries actually have such a thing as a Public Records Act, and again, is it implemented? As opposed to freedom of information to request the information, should the information be provided. The second thing is, I've had quite a bit to do with water, and so in terms of comparing water quality, where the rubber meets the road, in my view, is drinking water standards, and there can be quite a variation, because I know, for example, with New Zealand drinking water standards, we're actually allowed to drink basically a chemical cocktail soup when you compare it with European drinking water standards. So in terms of actually checking the real thing, I'd very strongly recommend that drinking water standards and what is actually being checked for is really important.
I'm not that familiar with our actual questions, but it's a good point that there can be subjectivity in different scientific standards, and perhaps we need to take another look and see if we match that across the board.
Yeah, but again, I think it's in the density and the way the questions are asked, because they're not set up for particular standards, but more of, and Christine or Sarah, you can respond directly on that.
And I will say, in terms of your first question on access to information, yes, we ask questions both about official information requests, whether people who request information can obtain it, and these were also questions that we asked about in the general population poll. So if somebody requests, official government documents about, public works or environmental issues in their country. So these are actually questions we asked both the general population.
The answer to the question is yes. I mean,
yes.
Her question was, do we make a distinction between open records laws and the right to make requests? And we do.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, well, she's got one over.
Is it my turn? Oh, thank you. Oh God. Hi. Well, I want to say that it's a super honor to be here with you. I'm a lifelong environmental activist. That was some of my first work right out of high school, and inspired me to go to college and get an international studies degree. And I'm a social worker. But anyway, that's enough about me.
That's good too.
I have questions for you, because being a human being in this world, I feel responsible and also impacted by all of these environmental issues, and I think it's very important. So the first question I'm going to ask, I think, is the most important one, or one of the most important ones, because there's lots. I was 7 months pregnant when Fukushima Daiichi disaster happened, and I want to ask you all, what are you doing for nuclear disarmament, and what are you doing to promote clean energy as an alternative? Because I hear what you're saying about coal mining towns, because that's destroying mountaintop removal all over the world. But what are we doing for solar power and wind power? Because we're here in the Netherlands, where there's beautiful windmills everywhere, and they're so cute, and I think that's my question. I don't have to ask my other questions.
Okay.
Are those enough? Is that good? Thank you.
Okay, should we want to respond to that, or should we take a few more? And,
Take a few, yeah.
yeah. How about, why don't you pass the guy?
Hi, my name is... Working?
Yep.
My name is Amir Jahangir. I'm from Pakistan. I work with the World Economic Forum on their various indicators. Can you brief me on is there a methodology to select the respondents? Because that is something which can improve or decrease the quality of answers in terms of the respondents. Next.
Okay. Those are two different questions. Let's see if we can take the first one first. I think I would say that my personal answer to your "what are you doing" to stop this, that could be answered by all of us in different personal ways. I don't know that this rule of law index is intended to do anything qualitative one way about nuclear-powered forms of energy or whatever. However, I think if you look at the questions and you look at questions relating to energy mix, general public health effects, various constituent elements of your questions go into a whole lot of the information that is sought in this questionnaire, in this rule of law index. So I think what we're doing basically through this index is providing a tool that will enable, through measurement, countries to improve their performance in that area.
With respect to alternative energy, you've got goal 7 of the SDGs, which talks about sustainable alternative energy. You've got goal 11 talking about safe, resilient, and sustainable cities, which will get to the same place you're talking about. I believe I read earlier this week or very late last week that a number of countries of the United Nations voted to go for continued nuclear disarmament in reaction to what's happening in North Korea. That's not something that this section of the ABA or the World Justice Project is doing directly, but I think it's tied into that. The other alternative energy side then has to go with nuclear power generation in the United States. I think that's here to stay in the United States. We're not going to go back to coal, in my opinion. I don't care what the administrator wants to do or what the president wants to do. The power companies are not going to go back to coal because it's not efficient for them to do it. They're not going to make money doing that. They're already converted to gas, to steam, to hydropower, to wind energy. So I think that's going to be the thing that's going to happen not only here but around the world. I mean,
yeah, and indirectly, but not focused specifically on the response to your question. What the environmental index does as it expands is provide context. And you can, one of the beauties of it, as you group various countries in the socioeconomic and the geographic areas where they are located, and you can draw comparisons. I mean, the visual ability to make those kinds of comparisons is wonderful, which is why this is such a terrific tool.
Yeah. Now, getting on to the second question, again, as I said, this is a pilot effort of releasing information. We know and freely admit that the sample source that we have is grossly inadequate, and indeed sometimes we had to beat the bushes to get people out to answer this. Definitely something that's going to have to be addressed in the future. What we hope is that as this picks up momentum, as it becomes more known, more and more people in these countries will want to answer it, will want to have better dissemination of the survey, so we will have truly significant statistical results.
I can expand just a little bit on the approach that we use to identify respondents. So we use the same approach that we use for our flagship Rule of Law Index, which is in part just doing research on, bar association websites, law firm websites, other professional association websites, researching through academic boards, things of that nature to identify qualified respondents. Ideally, we want our qualified respondents to be a more or less even split between practitioners and academics. And for obvious reasons, we don't want to survey people working for the government to, be measuring and ranking their own government. We also rely heavily on referrals as well. So for our, main QRQ surveys, we give people the opportunity to refer colleagues that might be qualified to take the survey. For this pilot, we relied very heavily on the task force to suggest in-country environmental lawyers who had helped draft several of the case studies that were in their international environmental law publication. And again, as Seth mentioned for the pilot, our threshold was very small in terms of just having 5 respondents, a minimum per country. But again, for the larger scaled up index that we're hoping to produce, we'd want 20 to 25 so that we can eliminate any outliers whose responses might look fishy and things of that nature. So having a much larger sample size is really important for scaling up the effort.
I think we could take one more question, and there's the hand right up there.
Seth, thank you. I am Juan Botero, Executive Director of the World Justice Project. I want to thank the ABA section on energy and the environment and the people that are not here, Roger Martella, Alex Dunn, and others that have been working with us for 6-7 years now on developing this process. All the questions related to the conceptual framework are critical in terms of defining whether we are measuring what we're supposed to be measuring. And in this session, what you see is, you see this list in each one of your desks. The objective of having this list here is precisely, we do not need to solve the problem of the environment tomorrow, nor we can. We have some time. We take things one step at a time. So please take this document with you. Tell us if these questions make sense. One thing that we know is this is too long. But if you are willing to invest the time, we beg you to please take these questions to your homes and send us feedback to Christine, to Sarah, or to myself on what is missing, whether the categories that we have selected make sense, whether the way they were aggregated makes sense. I also want to thank these 2 ladies for the enormous amount of work that went into preparing this pilot. A pilot is what you do to see if it holds. And after having seen all this work, my strong impression is that we are into something. Because the first results make a lot of sense. We checked that against the comparative qualitative literature, and they make a lot of sense. So at the aggregated level and at the disaggregated level. So we are extremely excited about this product. We hope to expand it. Again, as some of you know, this has been a volunteer effort for years. That's why it went so slow. We need funding to make it take over and pick up. And again, thank you very much to all of you for your next work in reviewing the questions.
Yes.
And thank you all for what we've done so far.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you.